So, as we said earlier, the European Union has now rejected the 60-day ultimatum Iran gave world powers to fulfill their commitments to the 2015 nuclear deal. And in the EU's joint statement with the foreign ministers of France, Germany and the UK, they said this: "We note with great concern the statement made by Iran concerning its commitments under the GCPOA. We remain fully committed to the preservation and full implementation of the GCPOA. At the same time, we recall our own firm commitments under the agreement in regards to lifting sanctions for the benefit of the Iranian people. We regret the reimposition of sanctions by the United States following their withdrawal from the GCPOA." Zein Basravi is joining us from Tehran, and I suppose we just have to wait and see what official reaction comes out from Iran to that EU statement, Zein.
Yes, exactly. We can get a sense of how the Iranian government might have seen this coming or might generally feel about their European partners, the other signatories to the nuclear deal. In multiple statements from government officials yesterday, they actually chided the European signatories to the deal for not being more independent from American policies, not just against Iran, but across the board. And Iranian leaders have said that it is time for European leaders to really make a decision of whether or not they want to implement their commitments to this deal in the face of American pressure for the sake of their own sovereignty, as Javad Zarif also suggested during his trip to Moscow to meet his counterpart Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia. And we are really getting a signal that in the last few weeks and months, there have been lines drawn in the sand by the United States and by Iran. And Iran has slowly, over the course of the years since the United States pulled out of the nuclear deal, drifted away from depending on European partners for anything but moral support. They've said over and over again that the words that have come from European capitals have been fantastic, but it has not been followed up by tangible action. The European countries have not been able to win the support or the trust of their own private companies to believe in the financial bypass that has been set up with Iran to continue trade. And so that really hasn't had any sort of functional impact on bettering Iran's economic circumstances. Iran has pivoted in recent months more sharply to countries like Russia, to countries like China. We heard China's support for Iran yesterday when the President Hassan Rouhani announced his plans to lessen commitments to the nuclear deal, lessen cooperation with the nuclear deal, and China happens to be one of the biggest purchaser of Iran's raw materials, its metals, upon which the United States has placed additional sanctions. So with European countries who also imported a lot of Iranian raw materials already limiting their economic interaction with the country, Iran is likely to focus on allies like China and Russia to continue to be able to sustain its economy through these very difficult times under U.S. pressure.
As you're saying, Zein, these new sanctions were announced by the Trump administration on raw materials. It does seem that Iran is being increasingly cornered. Is there anything else that the government can do?
Absolutely. I think yesterday we saw with the foreign minister Javad Zarif in Moscow, Iran still has strong allies on the international stage. It might be isolated economically, but it certainly isn't alone in dealing with the United States and U.S. pressure. And speaking of pressure, there are still certain pressure points that Iran independently can also turn to in a sort of response to America's ongoing sanctions campaign. The Strait of Hormuz, of course, is a major thoroughfare for oil lanes, for oil shipments. 20% of the world's consumed oil goes through the Strait of Hormuz, which is in Iranian care. And so they have said over and over again they could close the Strait of Hormuz in response to Iranian oil sales being stopped. We have also seen that President Hassan Rouhani, in his speech yesterday, also mentioned Iran's international role. It still very much is involved in many international efforts. He mentioned the Afghan refugee population that lives in Iran. He also mentioned Iran's ongoing drug war on the borders with Afghanistan and Pakistan, all things that would impact Europe if Iran was to take its foot off the gas. Rouhani suggested that it costs Iran billions of dollars to host refugee communities, to fight a war against drug trafficking, and if it became too expensive because of economic sanctions, it would have to reconsider its commitment to those things that could have an international impact, that could see a new refugee crisis, that it could see an influx of of drugs, of illicit drugs, coming across Iran and into other parts of the world. So those are things that Rouhani tried to use to say that Iran should not be isolated. It is an international country, it is part of the international community, and it needs to be treated as such.
Okay, Zein Basravi with an update from Tehran. Zein, thank you. Let's now cross over to Paris and speak to Natacha Butler, who will talk us through that EU statement that was just released a few moments ago. Natacha, rejecting Iran's 60-day ultimatum. Was it expected?
Well, I think what we're seeing is European powers trying to draw their own boundaries in a way as they become increasingly trapped in the middle as the situation escalates between the United States and Iran. What the EU is saying in this joint statement, it came from the EU's foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini's office, and it's done in conjunction with the foreign ministers of Britain, France and Germany. What they're saying is that they reject any ultimatums given by Iran. Now, that refers to the fact that on Wednesday, Iran told European powers that they had 60 days to come up with some sort of plan or way to bypass the impact on Iran of these US sanctions. Now, of course, the European Union, European leaders would know that it's probably quite unlikely they'll be able to come up with anything in that time frame. And what they're rejecting is the imposition of that time frame in the first place, because what EU leaders have been saying all along is that they're doing everything they can to try and support this deal, to try and support this 2015 accord that they say is the best bet for regional peace, security and stability in the region. They are saying that they are working hard to support Iran. So I think, in a sense, this is the EU saying to Iran, we understand, we are trying to do our best, but we won't be dictated to as to how long we have to try and come up with perhaps a better strategy to contour these US sanctions.
And I suppose the big question is, Natacha, is how long the EU feel like they can continue to back the agreement if they think Iran is not complying with it? Because we saw just 24 hours ago Iran saying that it'll suspend some of its commitments.
That's right. And the French defense minister on Wednesday said that if Tehran does violate this agreement, then the EU would consider reimposing sanctions. Now, the statement that came out today also talks about the fact that Iran must not violate this agreement. There is a call to Tehran not to do so, to stay within the commitments that it made for the 2015 agreement. So I think what EU leaders really want is to try and de-escalate the situation. They certainly talk about that in this statement. And I think today they will actually gather at an EU summit in Romania. Iran wasn't supposed to be on the agenda, but I think there's no doubt that it will be. And what they'll have to do is try and come up with some sort of plan or strategy. In earlier this year, they created an EU payment system called Instex that's designed to try and bypass some of these US sanctions, allowing Iran and EU to trade in a certain number of humanitarian areas, so things like food and medicine. But that certainly doesn't work for those big multinationals like the French oil giant Total or the German car maker Daimler. It is not going to persuade them to come back to Iran and do trade and risk US penalties. And the EU know that, which is why they're in such a difficult position. And it is very difficult at this stage to see exactly what they could come up with that would satisfy the Iranians and manage to keep this deal alive.
All right, Natacha Butler, thank you.